You're listening to Nightlight.
Hello and a warm welcome once again to Nightlight. Well, we've been posting 2 new podcasts every week on a wide variety of topics. And on this show, we're going to enter the battle between those who believe in the theory of evolution versus those who believe in the biblical account of creation. And my guest on the show is John Lyall, who writes and lectures on creation science. Welcome to Nightlight, John.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We have a guest tonight on Nightlight.
I'd just like to make the point that the teaching in most science textbooks that there is no creator, that God has nothing to do with the formation of the natural world or the origin of the human race or the plant and animal world, that this kind of teaching actually does have harmful effects from the ethical point of view. After all, if I think there's no creator, then what does it matter what I do in this life? If I think I'm an animal, that I'm just a descendant of a monkey, what's to stop me from acting like just an animal driven by instinct? There's nothing about right or wrong. Everything is just a struggle for survival. And so this kind of ethical harm is being done, I feel, to our young people when we teach them that in their earlier years that God has nothing to do with the formation of the natural world. Mm-hmm. Hitler depended a great deal on evolution. It was the basis for his genocide of what he called inferior races, the survival of the fittest and all that. And then also, when you feel aimless or depressed or something, if you think there's no God, you're really lost. And if we don't teach our young people about the role of the Creator in forming the natural world, it's like we're sending them adrift into the sea of aimlessness and uncertainty and depression. We need to give them the right understanding so that they will have that assurance that there is a higher power that loves them and can help them in their times of they don't feel purposelessness, they need a purpose in life, or feeling depressed and so on. And also to have that sense of accountability. When I get to the end of the road, I am going to stand before my Maker. And I am accountable for what I do in my lifetime. Okay, but anyway, aside from the ethical side of it, from a scientific point of view, evolution theory as it is now is losing its credibility in the scientific world.
Why is that?
Over the last maybe 10 or 20 years, scientists have been discovering about DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Inside every cell in your body, this is an amazing fact, you have 3 billion of these, what they call 4-character digital codes.
In every cell?
In every cell of your body. And these are like the blueprints. Just like blueprints for a building, they guide how the building is supposed to be built. So DNA is the same thing. It guides how your body is supposed to grow and develop.
How many billion in one cell?
3 billion.
My
3
gosh.
billion, yes.
So it's not just a simple cell, as Darwin thought.
Yes. So when you have something like these blueprints, that's information. Now, when you have information, then there has to be an intelligence behind it. There has to be an author. If you see hieroglyphics, well, there was an intelligent person that wrote those hieroglyphics. They didn't just get there by themselves. If you see a textbook, again, there's an intelligence, an author behind it, or this morning's newspaper. So information that's locked in our cells, how did that get there? How did the blueprints for a building get there? An architect made them, right? How did the information in our body cells, how did the DNA information, how did it get there? There has to be an intelligent designer. And this discovery about what DNA does in our biological makeup so astounded one atheist philosopher by the name of Sir Anthony Flew that he discarded his atheist beliefs and he became a believer. He knew, hey, God does exist. There has to be a God. Otherwise, how did this DNA information get there in our body?
Right, John, I've heard there's not just one, but there's many scientists who are coming to the same conclusion.
It's an inescapable conclusion. It's hard to worm out of it. And so many scientists are realizing there has to be intelligent designer. In fact, many of the great scientists, Einstein, Kepler, Sir Isaac Newton, Galileo, they all had a very strong faith in God. And they felt that science just was helping them to discover more about God's creation.
Switch off and switch on to Nightlight.
Okay, now I'd like to talk about another aspect here, monkey-to-man evolution. You usually see this picture of a monkey gradually changing into a modern-day Homo sapiens. Let us just take a look at some of the different so-called ape-men. Neanderthal man,
I remember him.
the first fossil was discovered in 1859. Since that time, scientists have begun to realize that the Neanderthal tribe of people were fully human. They had a different body structure, slightly different structure, but basically the differences were no greater than some of the differences that we see in the races of mankind today. The study of the Neanderthal man has shown he has the same brain size as we do. In fact, most of them actually have larger brains, skulls. They buried their dead, they used tools, they had a complex social structure, they employed language, they played musical instruments. So really they're just a branch of the human race. Another well-known ape-man or missing link was the Piltdown man. Now, and this was in 1912. This was a total forgery. The man who did this, he got a human skull, stained it, make it look old, and he got a jawbone of an orangutan, stained it to make it look old, filed the teeth so that the teeth would look more human, put them together, buried them somewhere, and then later dug it up and said, aha, I found the missing link. This missing link, so-called, was in our textbooks for 40 years. Can you imagine? It was a total forgery, but there it was, the great missing link in our textbooks for so long. Until finally in 1953, someone realized that, hey, this is a phony. They did some tests on it, and they realized the whole thing was just a fake. The next missing link to come along was Java man. Someone was digging in Indonesia. They found a human thigh bone not far from an ape-like skull. So the scientists assumed that, oh, they're part of the same creature. I've got a human and an ape bone together. Oh, good, this is our missing link. Later investigation showed that the skull belonged to a gibbon, and the other bone had nothing to do with it. It was just a scientist, I guess, wanting to find the missing link. So then Nebraska man, in 1922, somebody found a tooth, and they made this great reconstruction of some kind of apish-like figure based on just a single tooth. Again, later on, investigation showed that tooth didn't actually belong to a man or an ape or anything, but to a peccary, which is the relative of the pig. In more recent times, in the 1970s, the Australopithecus fossils were found. Now here again, it's a matter of misinterpretation, really. Originally, this was proclaimed as, oh, here we have the great missing link, and glossy presentations were made in certain magazines and so on. So everybody was convinced, oh, here we found it, finally found it, the missing link. But then later in computer investigations came to show that these bones just belong to those of an ape that has gone extinct. Again, it's a question of misinterpreting the evidence. It's like a detective. A detective is supposed to look for evidence, but a good detective will take care to make sure to interpret it properly and not jump to premature conclusions. I suspect that's what's happened, that because of a preconceived idea of evolution, because it's almost a holy grail, if you can find the missing link, then you've really made a big discovery.
John, if man did evolve slowly from apes to humans over millions and millions of years, wouldn't there be millions and millions of missing links? Wouldn't we be finding them everywhere?
So that's another problem. There's really no evidence of missing links, not only with monkey to man, but also in the animal kingdom as well. There should be, as you say, millions of missing links, but they're just not there in the fossil record, and we don't see it today either. Some of the creatures that people have tried to say are missing links, when you look closely at them, you find that they're actually not really in between. They're pretty much either one or the other, belong to one or the other species. Here's an interesting quote from the brother of Charles Darwin. His name was Erasmus, and he wrote a letter to his brother, and he said, "Your theory is so entirely satisfactory to me that if the facts won't fit in, why, so much the worse for the facts is my feeling." So what he's saying there is, oh, this theory is so utterly profound that, well, if the facts, the evidence, if they should just mind their own business and take a back seat to the theory.
My goodness.
Well, this is not science.
Right.
It's quite a pleasant night when listening to Nightlight.
Okay, now having said all that, Darwin was correct about many of his observations. there is quite a bit of variety in the natural world that is caused by the process of natural selection. Species are able to adapt to their environments and make slight modifications, slight changes in their structure.
Right, but you're saying, John, that this can only happen within species, right? You can breed different kinds of dogs, for example, but you can never breed a cat with a dog or a bird with a fish or whatever.
Yes, every species has a basic gene structure that they cannot go beyond. In Genesis chapter 1, it is mentioned about 10 times God made the different species after their kind or after its kind. If you look in the natural world, there's a barrier of sterility between species. A cat cannot mate with a dog, otherwise you'd end up with a cat dog or something like that. Or even between closely related species, you'll run into this barrier of sterility. For example, a horse mating with a donkey, you end up with a mule, okay? But that mule is sterile, cannot have offspring.
So if you want more mules, you have to keep mating horses with donkeys. You can't get two mules to mate and have baby mules.
That's exactly right. A female mule could mate with a horse, but their offspring is a horse. Or she could mate with a donkey, and their offspring would be a donkey. So there's a barrier there, and for good reason, because otherwise, how confusing the natural world would become. And this was God's way of keeping order in the creation. Otherwise, you'd have quite a lot of confusion. So on the same principle, there's also a barrier that prevents a species from changing beyond certain limitation. Like we're talking about, there's many different breeds of dogs. They all have that same basic gene structure. A dog is still a dog. It doesn't change into another species. Again, it's just God's way of keeping order in the creation, in his natural world. Yet at the same time, he has allowed quite a bit of variety. We have so many different breeds of dogs, we have many different races of humanity, all kinds of varieties of plants and so on. Makes the world a more interesting place, doesn't it?
John, this is one of the reasons I'm convinced that God has to intercede soon, because now scientists are crossing that barrier that God has set in place to separate one species from another. And with gene splicing, tinkering with DNA, they're managing to create hybrid creatures, including developing so-called transhumans that would no longer be made in God's image. Anyway, let's go back, John, and talk about the so-called simple cell and why it's anything but simple. Tell us more about the complexity of a single cell and why it couldn't possibly have created itself by any kind of evolutionary process.
In Darwin's day, to them, and then, the cell was just a very simple thing. They thought it was just a blob of jelly that they could easily imagine might change and evolve. Nowadays, we know differently. Some studies have been done. One particular study by Michael Behe was very interesting about the flagellum cell. It's a self-propelling cell. In a study of it, he found that there are about 40 different protein parts that all have to be working together. And those parts work just like a motor. There has to be a propeller, a drive shaft, a U-joint, a way to get fuel from the environment, acid in. So many things just for this one little cell. It's just as complicated as a factory. It's just one simple cell.
And those things had to all be put into place at one time for the cell to work. In other words, that's I think they call it irreducible complexity.
Correct.
In other words, those parts couldn't have put themselves together. They had to be assembled at one time in order for the thing to work. Is that correct?
Yes. It'd be like going to an auto parts store. You could get all the parts you needed to assemble a car, but it's not going to assemble itself. Or if you did have a car and let's say the left front wheel was missing, your car is not going to work. So all the pieces have to be there simultaneously or it doesn't work.
And how complicated is the mechanisms within a single cell compared, let's say, with a car?
Well, I know you can safely say that it is just as complex as a car. Well, with 3 billion of those 4-character digital codes in the DNA, I guess you'd have to say it's a lot more complicated than a car.
It's Nightlight. What a delight.
Let's talk now about some of the basic laws of physics that the theory of evolution contravenes. For example, the first and second law of thermodynamics. Let's start with those.
Okay, so the difference between a law of science and a theory of science is the laws of science have been proven many, many, many times over. Theories are just ideas or concepts that haven't yet been proved. As we've seen already, there are plenty of proofs against the theory of evolution. Okay, so the law of thermodynamics, most people are familiar with the first law that energy can change state, but it remains constant. The level of energy is always the same, matter and energy. The second law states, I guess to sum it up, you could say the universe is getting disorderly. Let's say you burn a liter of petrol. It disperses into different molecules of carbon and hydrogen and so on. You don't get that back again. Right? Everything is getting more scattered, more disorganized. That's the whole natural tendency of the natural world, and it's a law of science.
Even your room, if you just leave it, it's going to get untidy.
That's right. Yeah. If you don't maintain your house, it's going to collapse.
So anything left to itself tends to deteriorate.
That's right. Yeah. So there's no process in the natural world where things are getting more organized
on their own.
Yeah, which is contrary to the theory of evolution. So that leads to a big question: can life emerge from non-life? According to that law of science, no. How could it? How could it possibly, just a few amino acids manage to, build themselves together and build proteins and DNA and then build a cell and so on? So it wouldn't work. There was a famous experiment done in 1953, I believe, the Miller-Urey experiment, and they were able to create some amino acids in the laboratory. Now, amino acids are not themselves alive. They are the building blocks for protein molecules, DNA molecules, and so on. So at the time it was thought that, this is a great discovery. This proves that life can emerge from non-life. But then later investigation showed that, okay, you might be able to create some amino acids, but it doesn't go any further than that. And even the amino acids that they managed to get in the laboratory were certainly not all the amino acids that are needed. It's a bit like our illustration earlier about the car. You can have all the parts, you can have all the amino acids you want, it's still not going to do anything without an outside force. The supernatural force has to be there to create, to bring the life.
John, what evidence is there in geology that the world was created and didn't evolve? What about these rock stratas that were taught at school, like you see in the Grand Canyon?
Well, from the uniformist or evolution point of view, is that all we see nowadays are gradual processes happening. The assumption has been very strong in the scientific world that should explain everything. But a closer look at the evidence does tell us otherwise. Well, for one thing, all the stratified sedimentary rocks, those had to be formed by water action. Do a simple experiment. If you just take a glass jar, fill it with dirt, and then some water, shake it, you see it settle into layers. So we see these stratified sedimentary rocks all through the world. So how did they get there? If they're all everywhere in the world, does that mean there were just little floods everywhere? It's quite obvious that, as we know from the book of Genesis, and I might add it's also in Mahabharata, the sacred book in India, it's in the Quran, and it's in many different ancient societies. I believe 270 at least ancient societies have this legend about a great flood that once covered the earth. What we now in our modern enlightened society think is just a fable or something, at one time it was just common knowledge. And the amazing thing about it is that the scientific evidence points very clearly to the action of this great flood in the geological structures. Now, for example, the Grand Canyon. Well, before I talk about the Grand Canyon, fossil formations. How do fossils form? What happens when an animal dies? Well, the soft tissues disappear. If the bones are left exposed to the elements, they'll disappear also. So in the natural process of things, fossils do not form. There has to be some kind of catastrophe so that the creature is buried quickly, is under pressure, and this is how fossils have to form. So what kind of catastrophe could that be? Well, where are most fossils found? They're found in sedimentary, water-formed rock. By flooding. Oh, a great flood. So it all makes sense. You have all this sedimentary rock all over the world. Some of the fossils are gathered in big graveyards, which provide very clear evidence that there was a massive washing away of herds of animals, and they're smashed into a common grave.
And there are also, John, fossils of fish being found on the top of mountains and things like that.
Yes, there are, yes. In fact, Mount Everest, the top 3,000 feet of Mount Everest is all sedimentary rock, and there are lots of marine fossils. What does that mean, you might wonder? Well, at one time, Mount Everest was just a flat ocean bottom. So in the process of recreating the Earth, there's a lot of tectonic earthquake activity going on. And this was the time of the creation of the mountain ranges like the Himalayas or the Andes or the Rocky Mountains. Geologists will tell you that these are young mountain ranges. They're young because they were formed later on at this time, at the tail end of the flood, I would imagine.
So the fish weren't stranded on the top of Mount Everest because it was covered with water at the time of the flood, and when the water went down, they were stranded there.
That's right, yes. Many parts of the Earth are original creation type of rock structure, and then of course many parts like Rockies, Himalayas, they are mostly the rock was formed as a result of the flood. Which brings me to another point. Grand Canyon is a very good example of the kind of erosion action that happened at the time of the flood. If you look at the Grand Canyon, you see all these stratified layers. This was the result of the flood. And those layers at that time had not consolidated. They had not had time to cement. And basically that was just soft mud. So as the waters were running over the land, they were able to gouge very deep canyons into the land surface there, because it was still soft, the land was still soft. Normally in erosion, what happens is the rivers, they can erode the soft banks of the river, and it makes kind of a long, shallow valley. But in this case, in many places of the world, it happens very quickly and it goes deep. And actually, you can see the same thing in miniature. I've seen it happen at beaches where the water gouges through the sand, makes a similar type of formation, or I've seen it in construction sites. There's been a lot of mud and dirt has been dumped. And then at the first rain, you see this peculiar canyons form. So it's the same thing with the Grand Canyon. That's how it was formed, just by the water action over the ground surface that was still very soft. These rock formations is such an incredible testimony of our ancient heritage, what happened in the ancient past. And I would see these rock formations all during my youth, and I had no idea what it was. But it's such a powerful, interesting, intriguing testimony of what God did at that time during the Great Flood.
Nightlight Insights.
John, tell me what you think about the Big Bang theory and the creation of the universe.
Well, I think the most important point to realize is the universe operates according to very precise laws and formulas. The universe came about as a result of, again, just like our biological forms and so on, there was an intelligent designer, God, the creator, behind it. So theories like the Big Bang theory don't make a whole lot of sense simply because it's a chaotic random process again that is believed to have created this wonderful order that we see in the universe.
I mean, John, anything that explodes just leaves a lot of debris and disorder, right? So how could something as mathematically precise as the universe come from something that went bang? And even if some little tiny speck of dense matter went bang and formed the universe with its planets and all of its matter originating from that source, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But even if it was so, where did the energy come to make that huge explosion in the first place? Who created the energy and the little dense dot that exploded?
If you know that God had to create the energy and God had to create the matter, then why couldn't God also do a lot more than just that?
Nightlight's Interview of the Week.
John, do you have a website or anywhere where people could get more information if they want to study this topic in more depth?
I do have my own website. It's called eduorigins.org. I think the best place, if you're looking for information on this subject, is the Case for a Creator video clips, which you can find quite easily on YouTube. Presentations are updated, upbeat, and scientific. It's a very good presentation on the subject of creation, and I would recommend it.
And thank you so much, John, for all you shared with us. God bless you.
And I really enjoyed it. Consider it a privilege to have been part of your Nightlight show.
You're listening to an international edition of Nightlight, shining God's love light to the world.
Well, don't go away, because on the last 10 minutes of this show, I'm going to play you part of an interview I did a few years ago with world-famous creation scientist Dr. Kent Hovind, who was speaking to me from his dinosaur adventure land in Alabama in the USA.
Nightlight.
Kent, maybe you could briefly just summarize your top reasons why the theory of evolution just is impossible. It couldn't be true.
Well, the first thing I do in the debates, and I've done about 120 of them now, is I define the word evolution. Exactly what are we talking about? I give it 6 different meanings or levels or stages of evolution. Number 1, you would have to have what they call cosmic evolution. That would be the origin of time, space, and matter. How did we get here? How did space get here? Where did matter come from? Where did energy come from? Where did the laws come from? Of course, the Bible answers that in the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The cosmic evolution is step 1, for which there is absolutely no scientific evidence that it happened anything other than God doing it. The atheists have tried to come up with a theory to answer that, called the Big Bang Theory. They say, well, one day nothing exploded and made everything. That's not an answer, that's a fairy tale. So, cosmic evolution is number 1. Number 2 would be chemical evolution. Because according to their Big Bang, the Big Bang would have produced hydrogen or helium. Well, how do we get all these other elements? You're going to make gold and silver and platinum out of hydrogen gas? I want to see how that happens. Number 3, you have to have stellar evolution. The stars have to evolve. And no one's ever seen a star forming. They see stars blowing up once in a while, but they never see one forming. So that's not observable. So the first 3 levels or stages of evolution are purely religion. They believe in them, but they don't have any science for that. Number 4 would be organic evolution, where life has to get started from non-living material. And nobody's ever seen that. They can't even make it happen in the laboratory. One atheist said, well, Hovind, suppose scientists make life in the lab someday. What are you going to say then? I said, well, first place, they are nowhere close to making life in the lab. But if they could make life in the lab, I guess that would prove it takes intelligence to make life, wouldn't it? That would prove creation, not evolution. Number 5, you have to have what's called macroevolution. That's where animals change to a different kind of animal. Nobody's ever seen that. Every farmer in the world counts on that not happening. He crossbreeds his cows, he expects to get a cow. When he plants his corn, he expects corn to grow. Macroevolution doesn't happen. The Bible says 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, and then 10 more times in the flood story, Genesis 6 and 7, that the animals will bring forth after their kind. And it uses the word kind, not species. A dog and a wolf and a coyote are different species, but they're the same kind of animal, and a 5-year-old knows that. There are 8 species of bears in the world: black bear, panda bear, grizzly bear, and they might have had a common ancestor, a bear. They're the same kind of animal. So God told Noah to bring onto the ark 2 of each kind, not 2 of each species. Anyway, so number 5 is called macroevolution, where an animal changes to a different kind. It's never been seen. Never. Number 6 is what we call microevolution, and I object to using that term, but they do, so we explain it. Microevolution would say variations happen within the same kind. You get big dogs or little dogs or hairy dogs or hairless dogs, but you always get a dog. So variations within the kind, number 6, now that one is science, microevolution. And in the mind of the evolutionist, those little changes that we observe can somehow magically add up to macroevolution. So they're going to give your students in school thousands of examples of number 6 and try to make them believe that that proves the whole theory. And it does not. It actually proves the Bible is correct. So the first thing I do in the debates or discussions is define this word evolution. What are we talking about? And that usually shuts down the whole debate right there, because all they can give from then on is examples of number 6, microevolution. I say, guys, that's just a variation of the same kind. That's not evolution.
Wow, that's a really good list. And of course, since the video series that I watched with my kids over 10 years ago, there have been many more advancements in science, such as fuller understanding of the complexities of DNA. Have there been any recent developments that you would say has strengthened your arguments against evolution?
Well, there are discoveries all the time that indicate this cannot be explained with any evolution. The deeper they get into the DNA and discover how amazing this is. You know, one person's DNA, if you extracted all the DNA out of your body, it would fill about 2 tablespoons. No, 1 tablespoon. But if you tied it ends to end and stretched it out, it would go from Earth to the moon and back 10,000 times or something. It's phenomenal, a huge number. That is the code to make you. Your body has that incredible computer code to make new cells and make eyeballs and make ears, etc. That's a phenomenal code. Darwin didn't know anything about that. Never heard of DNA or even chromosomes, I don't think, in Darwin's day. They thought the cell was a simple little sack of jelly. Now we know it is more, each cell in your body is more complex than a space shuttle. And the average person has probably 100 trillion cells with a T. I mean, there's only 7 billion people in the world, so you probably got more cells in your hand than there are people in the world. It's phenomenal. So I think the more research we do, the more people ought to stand in awe and say, wow, what a mighty God we serve. But instead, they try to figure out some way to explain it, naturally. If I told you, I want you to explain how computers got here, but you cannot use man as your answer, could you give me a naturalistic explanation for how computers could arise? Well, no. Somebody had to do it. And that's what we're doing now in our science class. We're saying, we want you to explain how the world got here, but you cannot use God as part of your answer. Okay, well then, conversation's over, because you've eliminated the only logical answer by your stupid rules at the beginning. Now, who is God and where did he come from and all that stuff? That's a different set of questions. But the fact is, there had to be a God design all this.
Yes, absolutely. Kent, where online can people go who haven't seen your videos and your classes on creation science? Can they search for you on YouTube? How can they find you?
Sure. Our website is drdino.com, D-R-D-I-N-O, Dr. Dino. YouTube, I do every day, sometimes several a day, answer questions and talk about various things. That is just my name, Kent Hovind, K-E-N-T-H-O-V-I-N-D. Kent Hovind Official is our YouTube channel.
Dr. Hovind, unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so very much for taking your time to come and share with us.
All right, well, thank you for having me, brother. Call anytime.
And that's it for me for now, and I'll be back just in a few days with another edition of Nightlight. God bless you. Bye-bye.